Brexit issues, i.e. economic, human and political issues discussed during the campaign about the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union, which was supported in the Brexit referendum of the 23rd of June 2016, with 52% of voters voting in favour of leaving the EU against 48% preferring to remain a member, according to a poll by Ipsos Mori released on the 18th of May. Issues identified by voters as being very important to them in deciding which way to vote were headed by the impact on Britain's economy, the number of immigrants coming to Britain, and Britain's ability to make its own laws. Issues identified as important by voters who said they were likely to vote leave were headed by the number of immigrants coming into Britain, Britain's ability to make its own laws, the impact on Britain's economy, the cost of EU immigration on Britain's welfare system, impact on public services, housing, the number of refugees coming to Britain to claim asylum, Britain's ability to trade with countries in the European Union, cost of EU membership fees, regulations by the European Union on British businesses, the impact on British jobs, and Britain's status in the world. Issues that had been identified as important by voters who were likely to vote Remain included the impact on Britain's economy, the number of immigrants coming into Britain, Britain's ability to trade with countries in the European Union, the impact on British jobs, the impact on the rights of British workers, Britain's relationship with other countries, the impact on British national security, the ability to travel in the European Union, the ability of British citizens to live and work in other European countries, and Britain's status in the world. Other issues were identified by 5% of respondents or less. This collection of issues is broadly in line with the findings of other surveys published during the campaign. Economy. The economy and the number of jobs lost or gained by a withdrawal are likely to be dominant issues. The BBC's outline of issues warns that precise figures are difficult to find. Scenarios of the economic outlook for the country if it left the EU are generally negative. In its May 2016 inflation report, the Bank of England said that a vote to leave the European Union might trigger a recession. Think tank Open Europe claims the most likely permanent effect on annual gross domestic product by 2030 upon leaving would range from -0.8% to +0.6%, but notes +1.6% is possible under widespread deregulation. Another, more narrowly focused study by the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics puts the figure between -9.5% and -2.2%. Research group Oxford Economics says that depending on the new trading relationship with the EU, the impact on the UK economy will be between -0.1% and -3.8% by 2030, than if the UK had remained inside the EU. The impacts would vary across sectors, but the group said that construction and manufacturing would be the worst affected. Those arguing to remain in the EU say that 3.3 million UK jobs are linked to the EU through exports and suggest that some would be lost in the event of a UK exit. A report by the Confederation of British Industry and PricewaterhouseCoopers found that the UK would lose between 350,000 and 600,000 jobs by 2030 if it left the EU. A KPMG report cites the UK's EU membership as influential in its ability to attract investment in the automotive industry. Clifford Chance call on the importance of the EU internal market legislation in the UK's financial services sector. Groups in the Leave campaign, including the Institute of Economic Affairs, counter the claims of job losses by stating that whether EU membership is a net positive or negative for jobs and prosperity in the UK depends on what policies the UK pursues outside of the EU, rather than membership itself. The Leave campaign argues that a reduction in red tape associated with EU regulations would create more jobs and that small to medium-sized companies who trade domestically would be the biggest beneficiaries. A more detailed examination of the report shows that this analysis was conducted on the basis of impact assessments made by the UK's civil service before regulations came into force. Few impact assessments are carried out after the introduction of regulations, so it is very difficult to properly analyse their impact. A review by the UK government examined the level of EU regulation on the UK and found that UK businesses benefited from access to the single market, and therefore accepted that a level of regulation and harmonisation was desirable. The same report said that UK economy is bigger because of access to the single market. A study by Open Europe on the 100 most expensive EU regulations found that they cost the UK £27.4 billion per year and that 24 of those regulations had a net cost to the UK. The EU's importance as a trading partner and the outcome of its trade status if it left is a disputed issue, while those wanting to stay trade with the EU is valued at £400 billion annually. Those arguing to leave say that its trade is not as important as it used to be. Trade barriers with the EU such as tariffs on UK exports could emerge if the UK left. The Leave campaign observes that countries such as the US, India, China and Japan still conduct significant volumes of trade with the EU. It says it would put the UK in a better position to trade with other economies such as BRIC countries. Some Leave campaigners, such as James Dyson, have spoken favourably about tariffs on EU goods as a possible source of tax revenue. He also suggested that as Britain ran a £100 billion trade deficit with EU countries, it would be very much in the EU's interests to minimise trade barriers. Dyson also argued that keeping the exchange rate of the pound against the euro competitive was much more important than a lack of tariffs for British exporters to sell the products into European markets. On the 14th of April 2016, Conservative politician John Redwood argued that Britain would end fiscal austerity by leaving EU, pointing out that leaving EU would allow UK to scrap VAT on energy, tampon and others, claw back money from Brussels and increase social welfare expenditures, and embrace the World Trade Organization rule to trade with other countries without paying anything. On the 20th of April 2016, former Governor of Bank of England, Mervyn King, said that those treating the EU referendum debate as a public relations campaign tended to exaggerate the economic impact of a British departure from EU. The UK's EU membership fee. Britain pays more into the EU budget than it receives. The net contribution figures range from £5.7 billion to £8.8 billion depending on sources and the time frame. In 2014, the UK was the third biggest net contributor to the EU budget, or the eighth highest by net contributions per head. The membership fee paid by the UK to the EU has been used extensively by the Leave campaign as an example of how the UK would benefit from leaving the EU. The Leave campaign claimed the cost as £350 million per week, a figure criticised as misrepresentative by Sir Andrew Dilnot. The net transfer of cash from the UK to the EU in 2014-15 was £8.5 billion after subtracting the UK's rebate and the money spent directly by the EU in the UK, since it is the gross rather than the net amount. This represents about 1% of government spending at 2% of taxes received. The Remain campaign has used the figure of 1% in the referendum leaflet but have otherwise not discussed these figures widely in their campaigning. Leave campaigners argue that this transfer of cash is a hidden tariff for exported goods, while the Remain argument claims the net contribution is negligible in comparison to the benefits to business. In either event, changes to government finances as a result of the economic benefit or loss from leaving or remaining are likely to outweigh the membership fee. Fiscal policies. Conservative MP and Conservatives for Britain member John Redwood has argued leaving the EU is necessarily to enable the UK to abolish VAT on tampons and green goods. According to Redwood, legislative proposals outlined in a consultation document show that the EU intends to move to further centralise VAT policies, having concluded that more flexibility on VAT for EU member countries could damage the single market, and any move to allow more flexibility on VAT rates would require the unanimous consent of the 28 countries and the European Parliament. Redwood has also argued that European courts' rulings have made it more difficult to levy corporation tax on some firms and amend tax codes. According to Redwood, the HM Treasury has stated that Britain lost more than £70 billion from tax cases in the last Parliament, and this is mainly because of European Court of Justice decisions, and that UK was forecast to lose more over the next 5 years. Many supporters of Brexit have also suggested that as Britain is a net contributor to the EU, the UK government could continue to guarantee grants to farmers, universities and regions currently paid out of its contributions to the EU budget after leaving the EU, and still be able to apportion more to other public services or tax breaks. However, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has warned that the economic impact of withdrawal would reduce public finances by far more than its contribution to the EU budget, suggesting that the government would likely be forced to impose further austerity measures. According to the IFS, every 1% decline in GDP would force the government to find an extra £14 billion in additional taxes or cuts, with the think tank noting that the NIESR forecast of a 2% to 3.5% decline in GDP by 2019-20, resulting from Brexit, was the midpoint of the various economic forecasts they had looked at. George Osborne has stated that if the UK were to vote to leave, his response would be to raise taxes and cut spending to fill a £30 billion black hole in public finances. 57 Conservative MPs have said that they would vote to block his proposed emergency budget. Immigration. Citizens of EU countries, including the United Kingdom, have the right to travel, live and work within other EU countries, as free movement is one of the 4 founding principles of the EU. Campaigners for Remaining said that EU immigration has had positive impacts on the UK's economy, citing that the country's growth forecasts are partly based upon continued high levels of net immigration. The Office for Budget Responsibility also claimed that taxes from immigrants boost public funding. The Leave campaign believe reduced immigration would ease pressure in public services such as schools and hospitals, as well as giving British workers more jobs and higher wages. In 2011, David Cameron of the Conservative Party made the promise to bring net migration to the UK under 100,000 by 2015, but the government did not meet this target, and net migration rose to 336,000 in 2015. According to the ONS, net migration from the EU had risen to 183,000 in March 2015, an increase of 53,000 from March 2014. This has been used by Eurosceptic parties such as UKIP to campaign for leaving the EU. However, British Major General Jonathan Shaw has argued that more than half of the 332,000 immigrants came from outside the EU, which has nothing to do with EU membership. However, the UK government's official migration figures themselves are highly controversial, because the number of national insurance numbers claimed in the same period was 630,000, more than double the official migration figures. Since 2003, a bilateral agreement between the UK and France known as La Touquet Agreement allows British border control offices to screen immigrants before they leave France. In March 2016, Emmanuel Macron, the French Minister of Economy, Industry and Digital Affairs, warned that should the UK leave the EU, this agreement could be terminated. He added that the Calais jungle could be transferred to mainland England as a result. However, French Interior Minister Bernard Cazeneuve completely dismissed the claim by Mr. Macron, saying that if the Touquet Treaty was terminated, it would give a green light to people smugglers and would only boost the numbers of migrants trying to cross Europe. The UK Statistics Authority sent a letter to the ONS and expressed concern that there were discrepancies between the Department for Work and Pensions and the Office for National Statistics figures. The ONS data showed that 904,000 EU nationals moved to UK, while the DWP data showed that the 2.25 million EU nationals registered national insurance numbers during the 2010 to 2015 period. Ed Humferson, Director General for Regulation at UKSA, wrote that the lack of a clear understanding and explanation of the differences between the DWP and ONS figures had led to speculation about the quality of the statistics, adding that the ONS's May publication would be part of the statistical evidence to inform the public about immigration levels ahead of the EU referendum. EU migration and EU nationals who registered NINO on the 19th of June 2016. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said to Andrew Marr that there could be no upper limit on the number of migrants coming to Britain while there was free movement of labour in the EU, adding that, instead of blaming migrants, people should criticise the government of imposing fiscal austerity measures. On the 21st of June 2016, David Cameron's former Director of Strategy Steve Hilton said that Whitehall officials told Cameron and Hilton 4 years ago that as long as Britain was in the EU, it was impossible for the British government to meet Cameron's target of reducing net migration to tens of thousands. According to Hilton, when Cameron reaffirmed his commitment to the immigration target in the 2015 Conservative Manifesto, Hilton assumed that Cameron was certain he could negotiate a solution within the EU, or Cameron was assuming Britain would leave the EU, after the announcement had been made as to the outcome of the referendum indicating that Britain would in fact leave the European Union. Rowena Mason, political correspondent for The Guardian, offered the following assessment. Polling suggests discontent with the scale of migration to the UK has been the biggest factor pushing Britons to vote out, with the contest turning into a referendum on whether people are happy to accept free movement in return for free trade. A Times of London columnist, Philip Collins, went a step further in his analysis. This was a referendum about immigration disguised as a referendum about the European Union. The Conservative MEP representing South East England, Daniel John Hannan, predicted on the BBC programme Newsnight that the level of immigration would remain high after Brexit. Frankly, if people watching think that they have voted and there is now going to be zero immigration from the EU, they are going to be disappointed. You will look in vain for anything that the Leave campaign said at any point that ever suggested there would ever be any kind of border closure or drawing up of the drawbridge. Impact on wages. In December 2015, Bank of England released a report about the impact of migration on wages. The Bow report said that the balance of the research on this issue suggests that the share of immigrants in the workforce has had little or no impact on the pay rates of the indigenous population. However, immigration has a negative impact on the wages of semi-unskilled workers. If the proportion of migrants working in semi-unskilled services increased by 10%, the average wages of semi-unskilled workers decreased by 1.88%. The research showed that for skilled jobs, a 10 percentage point rise in the proportion of migrants working in skilled services drove down the average wage of skilled workers by 1.63%. Immigration's downward pressure on wages was partly because of the compositional effect. Basically, migrants make less money than natives, and as the number of migrants increases, the average wages decrease. Thus, the impact of immigration on wages changes, depending on the share of migrants, and on the difference in wages between migrants and natives within an occupation. The Bow analysis showed that compositional effect came into play in skilled jobs, about 1.13%. For semi-unskilled jobs, the compositional effect was small, and the impact of immigration on the wages of semi-unskilled workers was much larger than the compositional effects could account. On the 3rd of March 2016, Stuart Rose, a former executive chairman of Marks and Spencer and the head of the Remain campaign, admitted that wages in Britain would increase if Britain left the EU and decreased the number of EU migrants, adding that an increase in wages was not always a good thing. Rose argued that wages were affected by a wide range of factors, including the supply of labour and overall strength of the economy. On the 14th of April 2016, Telegraph said that Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn admitted that EU migrants undercut British workers' wages. Corbyn said that benefits of migration would be felt only if a government trained enough skilled workers to stop employers exploiting migrant workers to undercut wages and invested in local services and housing in areas of rapid population growth. Sovereignty and influence. A key question in the debate is where decisions should be taken, and at what level ultimate legal authority is vested. A primary slogan of the Vote Leave campaign has been for Britain to take back control, while according to Britain Stronger in Europe, membership of the EU gives Britain not only more economic strength, but also more influence and a stronger leadership role. In polls for YouGov, a third of voters selected which is likely to strike a better balance between Britain's right to act independently and the appropriate level of cooperation with other countries as the issue that would be most important to them in deciding how to vote. One area where the issue of sovereignty arises is the primacy of EU law over the laws of the United Kingdom. As a matter of British constitutional law, the primacy of EU law in the UK is derived from the European Communities Act 1972, a statute which, in theory, can be repealed by the UK Parliament at will. Security, law enforcement and defence. In February 2016, 13 of Britain's most senior former military commanders urged voters to back EU membership to protect British national security. Also, in February 2016, Rob Wainwright said that a UK departure from the EU could inhibit police cooperation and cross-border investigations in Europe, at least until an alternative arrangement is agreed. Speaking to police professional, he said that, if the UK was to vote to leave, it would no longer have direct use of pan-European databases of the ability to automatically join intelligence projects such as the European Migrant Smuggling Centre, the European Counter-Terror Centre and the European Cybercrime Centre. Some EU counter-terrorism experts, British police and intelligence agencies have suggested that that interagency cooperation across the EU could be improved in the light of the Schengen Agreement. They added that the UK had a single, well-policed border and better intelligence, and that neither was a result of belonging to the European Union. On the 21st of February 2016, Work and Pensions Secretary Ian Duncan Smith, who was a Eurosceptic as early as 1992, opined that remaining in the EU would make it more difficult to prevent terrorist attacks, because only by leaving the EU can the UK regain control of its borders. He went on to suggest that the terrorists of the November 2015 Paris attacks had travelled to France from war-torn Syria, and neither France nor the EU itself had been able to prevent the attack. Shortly after the remarks, Shadow Home Secretary Andy Burnham deplored what he called highly irresponsible comments and inaccurate to boot, as the UK is not in Schengen. Meanwhile, Conservative MEP Timothy Kirkhope retorted that Duncan Smith was categorically wrong about security post-Brexit. Similarly, Labour MP Dan Jarvis went on to suggest that Duncan Smith's remarks were misjudged and wrong, adding, "This type of scaremongering should have no place in the vital debate about our country's future that will take place over the coming months." Labour MP Tristram Hunt agreed with Jarvis and called the remarks baseless scaremongering from a man who knows he's on the wrong side of the argument. Moreover, Jonathan Evans, the former Director General of MI5, dismissed Duncan Smith's remarks, arguing once again that EU membership kept the UK safe. On the 26th of February 2016, Head of Counter-Terrorism Command Richard Walton argued that UK's security depended on many different factors, but membership of the EU was not necessarily one of them, pointing out that Europol was irrelevant to day-to-day operations within the counter-terrorism sphere, and that the Schengen Information System did not necessarily control the movement of terrorists across the borders. Walton said that Britain did not need to stay in the EU to use it. Walton argued that perhaps the only security benefit of Britain being inside of the EU was European arrest warrant, but EAW is a mechanism to deal with serious and organized crime, rather than terrorism. On the 28th of February 2016, Major General Jonathan Shaw wrote an opinion piece in the Daily Mail suggesting remaining in the EU would protect Britain from cyber attacks as well as threats from migration and terrorism. He concluded that remaining in the EU would keep Britain safe. Major General Julian Thompson wrote in an article for the Daily Telegraph that the EU should have nothing to do with the UK's national security, which Boris Johnson echoed. He claimed that during the Cold War, it was NATO which prevented the Soviet Union's attack. Thompson claims that the EU played no role in reaching peace in the Troubles in Northern Ireland during 1968 to 1998. By contrast, Enda Kenny, Taoiseach of Ireland, claimed that EU membership played a significant role in ending the Troubles and achieving peace in Northern Ireland, and that a withdrawal from the European Union would put the Northern Ireland peace process at risk. 2 days after 2016 Brussels bombings, a former head of MI6 Richard Dearlove suggested that UK's security would be improved by leaving the EU, arguing that leaving the EU would enable Britain to dump the European Convention on Human Rights and have greater control over immigration from EU. Although Home Secretary Theresa May cited European arrest warrant as a reason for her backing the Remain campaign, Dearlove argued that the importance of European arrest warrant was exclusively related to crime. On the 25th of March 2016, former Central Intelligence Agency Chief Michael Hayden said that EU was not a natural contributor to national security of each of the entity states and in some ways got in the way of the state providing security for its own citizens, pointing out that national security was a national responsibility, and that EU states' intelligence agencies were very uneven. Hayden argued that France and Britain had very good and aggressive intelligence services, and Scandinavian countries small and still good services, while most of the rest of the European countries had small services, adding that Belgium had small, under-resourced and legally limited services. On the 17th of June 2016, Field Marshal Lord Guthrie argued that a European army, which the EU wanted to have, would damage NATO, pointing out that NATO made everything peaceful, and that Britain needed the Americans when things got really serious, pointed out that a European army was unnecessary duplication, a massive waste of money, and inefficient in terms of its decision-making. Lord Guthrie concluded that from Britain's national security perspective, leaving the EU was better.